We are watching the geography of our planet change in real time. As global temperatures rise, ice shelves that have stood for millennia are fracturing and collapsing into the ocean. To address this, the United Nations established Sustainable Development Goal 13, Climate Action. This framework sets explicit behavioral learning objectives. It directs educators to train a generation of citizens who will actively change their habits and push for climate-protecting public policies. For years, the default strategy to command attention for these goals has been shock. Media and educational campaigns rely on iconic, apocalyptic imagery: melting ice caps, devastating floods, and starving polar bears. This approach often triggers a psychological shutdown. Instead of motivating action, the sheer scale of the threat induces fear, powerlessness, and ultimately apathy. To achieve the behavioral objectives of climate action, increasing data transmission is insufficient. Educators must map and manage the learner's affective filter, the emotional response system that dictates how new information is processed and acted upon. Teaching more climate science does not automatically yield better environmental citizenship. If the psychological dimension is ignored, the facts alone will not cross the gap between knowledge and action. This disconnect becomes especially critical at a specific bottleneck in the educational system: university students actively studying to become teachers. In highly developed urban centers like Hong Kong, pre-service teachers spend most of their time in built environments, separated from the natural world. These university students arrive with fragmented prior knowledge about the climate. Their exposure is typically siloed into isolated high school geography modules or basic science classes discussing the greenhouse effect. Because this education is scattered across different subjects, these future educators enter the workforce without a cohesive framework. They have the raw facts, but lack the tools to process the emotional weight of an impending global crisis. Unresolved environmental anxiety manifests as learned helplessness. The student feels that the problem is too massive, and their individual agency is too small to make a difference. If higher education fails to address this emotional bottleneck, the cycle will repeat. These future teachers will inevitably pass their own climate apathy and paralysis down to the next generation of students. To solve this, we first need to map the emotional architecture of a climate learner. The foundation of this architecture is their affective baseline, the raw emotional state triggered when they are confronted with climate data. This diagram categorizes 21 climate-related emotions, sorting them into 3 distinct columns based on how they impact human behavior: positive emotions, negative emotions that motivate action, and negative emotions that lead to inaction. Looking at the third column, we find emotions like apathy, feeling overwhelmed, and feeling powerless. These are states of cognitive overload where the brain simply shuts down its behavioral response. When 93 pre-service teachers were surveyed in a recent study, their responses concentrated heavily on being worried and determined. But crucially, there was also a massive spike on powerless. This feeling of powerlessness results from continuous exposure to doom-laden media. When learners are bombarded with crisis data, but given no actionable pathways to solve it, the information acts as a heavy, paralyzing cognitive weight. The standard climate curriculum currently produces a baseline of learned hopelessness. This emotional state actively works against the behavioral goals of the United Nations Climate Action Mandate. To handle this paralyzing anxiety, the mind deploys an automatic defense mechanism known as construal level theory. Construal level theory is a psychological framework explaining how people mentally distance themselves from abstract or threatening concepts. According to this theory, the learner's psychological world revolves around a central concrete node, the concept of me, here, now. This is their immediate, lived reality. When incoming stress vectors from climate data threaten to overwhelm this center, the mind repels these vectors. It pushes the concept of the climate threat outward radially, turning a concrete danger into a vague abstraction. This radial expansion happens along 3 specific axes. The temporal axis places the threat far in the future. The spatial axis imagines the crisis happening in distant countries, and the social axis restricts the impacts to outgroups. Psychologists call this emotion-focused coping. It is an instinctive rationalization used to lower immediate anxiety by convincing the brain that the threat is distant and therefore requires no immediate personal response. This mental distancing directly contradicts physical realities. When local weather extremes flood a neighborhood street, the water destroys the illusion of spatial distance. Psychological distancing successfully buffers the student's immediate mental distress, but it completely severs the necessary link to personal behavioral action. Educators often assume that the ultimate antidote to this climate despair is simple: hope. But hope is not a single uniform emotion. Drawing on Snyder's hope theory, researcher Maria Olalla bifurcates environmental hope into two distinct psychological pathways. The first branch is constructive hope. This is meaning-focused. It pairs a desired goal with agency and pathway thinking, the belief that you have the willpower and a concrete plan to drive actual environmental action. The second branch is hope based on denial. This is an emotion-focused trap. It relies on wishful thinking and blind optimism to alleviate anxiety. The learner feels positive about the future simply because they deny the severity of the problem, which guarantees inaction. This denial-based hope often takes a specific form. To maintain their optimism without taking action, learners will question the anthropogenic or human-caused origins of climate change. In the EDUHK study, roughly 1/3 of the surveyed future teachers exhibited doubts about the linkage between climate change and human activities. Hope based on denial is a significant threat even within university education departments. It is dangerous because it masks inaction as optimism, allowing future educators to feel good while doing nothing. This chart illustrates the complete psychological architecture of a climate learner, rebuilding the conceptual framework derived from the study. At the top of the diagram, we have the historical inputs. A student's perspective is shaped by their prior formal and informal learning experiences, as well as the perceived attitudes and communication styles of their past teachers. These inputs route downward into the central processor. Here, the student filters the data through their psychological coping mechanisms, generating their specific affective emotions toward the crisis. Finally, the diagram diverges into the behavioral outputs. Depending on how the central processor manages hope and fear, the student will either commit to constructive climate action or sink into hopelessness and inaction. The student's response to a climate curriculum is the measurable output of this predictable psychological equation. Any curriculum that ignores this central emotional processor is systematically designed to fail at producing proactive environmental citizens. Diagnosing the psychological bottleneck is only the first step. University curriculum developers must change how this information is delivered. Higher education institutions must explicitly integrate the affective domain, the emotional and psychological landscape of the learner, into their pedagogy. Instruction must pivot away from fear-based framing. Educators need to actively model meaning-focused coping, teaching students how to find personal relevance in the challenge rather than running from it. The critical tool to bypass psychological distancing and denial is pathway thinking, the practice of identifying specific, feasible routes to achieve a desired goal. In practice, pathway thinking moves past global abstractions. It focuses the learner on concrete mitigation strategies, civic engagement, and advocacy for actionable local policies. Educators must intentionally engineer this constructive hope. It will not naturally arise as a byproduct of simply presenting more scientific data on carbon emissions. Mastering this emotional architecture equips the next generation of educators to lead through the climate crisis with agency and resilience.